No? There we go. There we go. Oh, back away a little bit. Thank you for coming to our panel on Retrieving Television's Past. I want to quickly just say that we are missing one set of panelists today. Julian Thomas and Ramon Lobato cannot be here, but our other panelists are here and will present in the order that they're listed. And so first I would like to introduce Carol Stabile from the University of Oregon, who has the extremely compelling title of Red Lassie, meaning more than one thing, I think. Carol.
Hi, everyone. I've been working on this for nearly 10 years, so I have way too much to say and not enough time to say it in. I want to thank Michele because really this project, I was telling her earlier, grew out of something she'd said in Radio Voices about the emphasis in feminist media studies on women as consumers of television and radio and not enough on women as producers. So this is from a project that looks at what did not make it onto television screens in the 1950s through archival research on women who were writing for or around television in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, all of whom lost their jobs because of the blacklist in broadcasting. And there you have it, the Bible of the blacklist, red channels. These were women who had successful careers before the blacklist, who believed in civil rights, immigrants' rights, and women's rights, and who also believe that entertainment programming should reflect those kinds of values. It was a very popular front idea. Very few of the women, and there's a quote from Red Channels, just so you can read it at your leisure. Very few of the women that I'm writing about were communists or members of the Communist Party, although most did believe in economic justice. A good number of them were New Deal liberals who were blacklisted because of their advocacy for FDR and their support for Henry Wallace. So the first woman I want to talk about is Shirley Graham Dubois. How many of you have heard of Shirley Graham Dubois? Yes, excellent. Shirley Graham Dubois was, there's so many firsts in her life and her career, it's hard to know where to start. She was the first African-American woman to write and produce a black cast opera. She was the only woman to direct a Negro unit of the Federal Theater Project. She wrote numerous novels about African Americans in history in the 1940s and the 1950s. So she was writing novels about Jean-Baptiste Pointe de Sable. Anyone hear of Jean-Baptiste Pointe de Sable, who is the Haitian founder of Chicago? She wrote a book about Benjamin Banneker, who is an African-American mathematician and a clockmaker who helped lay out Washington, D.C., and she was really committed to the project of making sure that children in particular had access to information about the role that African Americans had played in the making of the United States. And almost all of these novels also sort of grappled with histories of slavery and slavery as an institution. It was rumored that Shirley Graham Dubois, and there's the cover, Jean-Baptiste Pointe de Sable, she also, two of her adolescent fiction novels were produced for CBS radio. So they were actually the story of Phyllis Wheatley and her award-winning novel about Frederick Douglass were both produced for radio. And there she is on the set. It was rumored that she was in line to head up the CBS documentary unit, which was taken over by who? Murrow. And it's interesting to kind of speculate about what might have happened had Shirley Graham Dubois been involved in that. She wrote, this is the quotes from the book, it was called Your Most Humble Servant, and it was about Benjamin Banneker, but the quote is really a quote from Thomas Jefferson, when Thomas Jefferson has his correspondence with Benjamin Banneker, and he signs off as Your Most Humble Servant. So it isn't, it's a very kind of interesting play on that. Shirley Graham married W.E.B. Du Bois in 1951, which is when the FBI begins their surveillance of both of them. By 1961, they're pretty much forced to leave the United States. They do it as soon as W.E.B. Du Bois is issued a passport. And so part of the project has been getting FBI files on the women writers. So you get a sense of why they're under surveillance and the extent to which they were under surveillance. So she and an elderly W.E.B. Du Bois moved to Ghana in 1961, where Shirley Graham goes on to become the first woman to found a national television system. Okay, and I like to begin with her just as a way of sort of foregrounding the creative talent and the kinds of insights that were really lost as a result of the purge in broadcasting. The second person or people I want to talk about are Adrian and Joan LaCour Scott. Adrian Scott, as many of you recall, was a member of the Hollywood 10 who served jail time. He was married to Joan LaCour Scott, who was a union activist and a writer in her own right. Neither of them could get work. She had been working for unions in Hollywood. Both of them were, well, Adrian Scott was blacklisted. She was graylisted. But she went on to write in front for Adrian, but also write under a pseudonym for herself. And this is an example of people who did leave a kind of mark on U.S. television. And you see the traces of a forgotten generation's voices in their writing, but they were really consigned to the margins of television production. So they wrote for, Lassie was the most consistent source of income for them, but they also wrote for Doctari and a little bit for Flipper. Joan LaCour Scott went on to write for Have Gun Will Travel, and also the Waltons later on. And it's interesting when you read the scripts and watch the programs for Lassie, and I don't have time to get into this today, but Lassie itself really diverges from the norm during that period. It's a rural show, it's a non-normative family, it's a single mom, and they live with an elderly grandfather. It's on the air for 20 years, so it morphs over the course of time. It becomes, at one point, there are two forestry rangers who have a very interesting kind of homosocial relationship. And that first line is from the forestry rangers, Papa does the hatching. And you see this language of division of labor, this kind of liberation theology focus. They're going to South America to improve crop yield among the peasants. And in one episode, and this is where the title of the paper comes from, Timmy and Lassie have a really interesting exchange about replacing the ice box. And Lassie is adamantly opposed to it because she's afraid it means that the ice delivery man will stop coming to visit the home. And so his line is, Lassie, you're a reactionary. Joan wrote for Have Gun Will Travel, and I just wanted to show you a sample of an exchange that was cut from the script, but that was originally in it. And I'm hoping that, Michele, will you read Paladin? And Erin, will you read Sandy?
Sure.
Right. Okay.
Tell me, Sandy, what does it take to turn a young woman into an outlaw?
Men.
Men decide what women want and what they need, but they never bother to ask a woman if she's happy with that.
I gather you weren't happy.
Would you be? Staying home and doing the same dull things every day of your life? Everything that's interesting or exciting in this world is reserved for men.
Okay, so that's in the script, but it was cut from the original version. Joan LaCour Scott went on to write for the Waltons, which became a haven for blacklisted talent. Earl Hamner Jr. Hired Will Geer, and I think that was the first job that Will Geer had after the blacklist. And so she went on to write for that. She was really interested in Native American rights, and so Joan LaCour Scott, I don't know if any of you remember the episode The Warrior, where two Native Americans come to Walton's Mountain to let the Waltons know that they actually have a claim to their land. The other thing I want to mention is a script that Adrian Scott was trying to shop around for years and years, at least 12 years according to the information I found in the archives, and it was about Ellie. And Ellie was a story about a woman who gets fed up with her ne'er-do-well husband and her two children and leaves them and refuses to come back until they pay her wages for housework. And she leaves the two little kids, she leaves the husband, she just says, I've had enough of this. And so it had this really kind of interesting narrative about the nature of unwaged labor. There's a quote, the government better get wise, that's all. It's hard being wife and mother. If they don't know that in Washington, someone ought to tell them. And again, over a 12-year period, Adrian Scott tried to get that made, and it never did. Now, maybe the last person I have time to talk about. Oh, we have more time? Okay. is Vera Caspary. Vera Caspary is probably best known as a noir writer who wrote the screenplay, well, the novel, and then the screenplay for Laura that was directed by Otto Preminger in 1944. But she had a really, really interesting, often risque kind of career before that. She wrote some novels that were considered very edgy for their time about women's lives in the 1920s. She was very much interested in race and class. And she was really interested in the Texas Guinan story. This is another characteristic of the Black Listees. They're not only interested in their own history, they're interested in the history of media, too, and the history of people who didn't conform in media industries. So Texas Guinan was during the short time she was alive. She was an MC. She owned a nightclub in Manhattan. She was one of the first cowgirl stars of silent film. Mae West modeled herself on Texas Guinan, and throughout the ages, you see different people trying to make that story. I think the most recent attempt was Madonna in 2004, because Guinan is really interesting. I mean, she's a strong, powerful figure. She doesn't play by the rules. She kind of does her own thing. And Vera Caspary was very interested in making this story in the 1950s. So this, again, is a kind of example of something that the Black Listees, or a topic that the Black Listees were interested in and would have gone on, I would argue, to produce. She also wrote a script called The Private World of the Morleys. This was in the early 1960s. And it was a family drama that feels a lot like Family, for those of you who have seen Family from the late 1970s. And it dealt with a lot of the issues that Family would go on to deal with. In fact, if it had been made, it would have been the first female surgeon on primetime. So one of the threaded stories that's at the center of the narrative is about the daughter's attempts to make it as a surgeon in a male-dominated world. This is 1961, 2 years before Betty Friedan published her book. Okay, I wish I had time to talk about Sapphire Films, but I don't. I'll just mention that Sapphire Films was founded by Hannah Weinstein, who was a producer. She had worked in advertising and marketing. She was the sort of creative force behind the mass rallies that were held in 1948 for the Wallace campaign. She saw the writing on the wall, more or less, because of the blacklist, and left and founded Sapphire Films, and then went on to produce, to generate the sort of craze in costume dramas. It was a short-lived craze, yeah, but it was a craze nonetheless, that happened in the 1950s. She hired at least 22 blacklistees from the United States. And there are plenty of FBI files on her. She was also being monitored from a distance because they were really concerned about the work that she was doing. There are The Adventures of Robin Hood. A quote. I mean, the thing that's also interesting about The Adventures of Robin Hood, if you ever get a chance to see it or read the scripts, is that it really is sort of rich with themes that the blacklistees were really concerned with things like bullying, authoritarianism, with folk culture and folk music and the sort of power of people to affect social change. And it's kind of interesting because it gets remade in 2006. And I think that this is kind of one of the points I'd like to leave with, is that because television has been such a cannibalistic medium, right, constantly revisiting its own themes and things it's produced before, we don't have that kind of richness here. And, when I think about a figure like Gertrude Berg, who's arguably the most important woman in broadcasting history, and the themes that she brought to television before she was graylisted, stories about Jewish life, about what it meant to be an immigrant. And I think about the years following the blacklist and the fact that, the only immigrants you really wind up seeing are like Balki and Perfect Strangers, who have to be from a different country, right? I mean, the blacklist makes those topics that are flagged as controversial really verboten throughout the next 50 years. I mean, it happens at, there's this chilling effect that gets built into the norms and the routines of the industry that I think then goes on to structure the limits of the possible and what can be imagined. And I just want to end with this quote by Gertrude Berg. Again, Gertrude Berg was not blacklisted herself. Phillip Loeb, who played her husband in the television series, was blacklisted. And the series jumped from network to network until it finally died a couple of years later. But this is something that she said later in an interview, having learned her lesson, I think. You see, darling, don't bring up anything that will bother people. That's very important. Unions, politics, fundraising, Zionism, socialism, intergroup relations. I don't stress them. And after all, aren't all such things secondary to daily family living? So, thank you.
All right. I want to apologize in advance. I'm recovering from a cold that I've had, or flu or something, for a week, so I've still got this scratchy throat thing. I'm preferring to think it makes me sound very mysterious and sexy. Thank you. In 2003, Ferris Thompson, who was then head of entertainment marketing at United Talent Agency, told Advertising Age this: "We're going to start seeing sponsorship used within TV programs that breaks the mold of commercial sponsorship, involving products within the entertainment in ways that have never been tried." And he goes on to describe an hour-long variety show with no commercial breaks, sponsored by products. I don't think I have to tell this room that that had, in fact, been tried many times, and was obviously the very earliest model of advertising within broadcasting. And I think that this quotation really sets the tone for my talk, which is that in an era where we have increasing threats and concern over what's going to happen to the traditional 30-second spot, advertisers and broadcasters alike have been trying to figure out, well, what can we do to sort of keep advertising relevant and working? And they're trying these brand new techniques of sponsorship and integrated advertising, which, of course, are not new at all. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about how those techniques emerged, what are sort of some of the governing logics of integrated advertising and sponsorship, and then talk about how those are precisely the same strategies and logics that are currently being used in television. So Cynthia Meyers actually mentioned this yesterday, and I'm going to go back to it again. But early radio, in early radio, there was a strong resistance to commercializing radio, and it wasn't just from audiences or the government, but it was also from broadcasters and advertisers alike, who were concerned that audiences wouldn't like having their entertainment content interrupted by these commercial messages, and excuse me, a very strong concern that the social and political potentialities of the medium would be sacrificed if you had a political speech that was, interrupted occasionally to sell you, Brill cream or something. That was the first. I don't know, why did that product come into my head? I don't know, but it did. And so this was a big concern. So you have this quotation from Congressman Emanuel Seller, 1923, who says that radio is of tremendous value for educational and amusement purposes, and advertising is worthless stuff, which interferes with instructive and informative broadcasting. So then, what do you do, right? If advertising, if you're concerned about how to fund this very powerful social medium, how are we going to pay for it? And advertising, commercializing the system is a logical way to do that. Well, how are you going to rectify those two things? And so the solution early on was to use indirect advertising. And Herbert Hoover, who early on had said that it was really going to be crass if you interrupted programming with advertising, Herbert Hoover says, indirect advertising could strengthen small stations without bothering listeners, involving the federal government, or hurting the large corporations involved in radio. So there's really this sense that if we can figure out how to do it right, that maybe it won't be such a problem. It's just a matter of figuring out how are we going to do it in a way that doesn't seem crass or over the top. And so you have the emergence of these indirect advertising techniques. And of course, the first move was to be as indirect as humanly possible. So you had very genteel was one of the words bandied about at the time, sponsorship. So I have these examples here, of course, of Lux Radio Theater, and then Rudy Valley's The Dreen Show, which was after the Procter & Gamble product Dreen shampoo. But the idea was we're just going to title the shows after the sponsors, and that's it. That's all. We're just going to have the show, and the title is going to involve the sponsor, and that's as invasive as we're going to get. Susan Smolyan has a case study of the Happiness Boys, which was sponsored by Happiness Candy Company in 1923. The title, and she says the title of the program, as well as the main characters that are all done after the brand, right? It's the Happiness Boys, named after the Happiness Candy Company, provided repetition of the sponsor unobtrusively. So we're constantly saying happiness over and over and over again, which is sort of funny because happiness is also just a word. It's not a brand name necessarily, but we're going to say happiness over and over again, and that's going to engender some sort of brand recognition among audiences. And audiences are also going to be so grateful for this programming, right? Thank you so much, Happiness Candy Company, for giving me Happiness Boys, that will create a market. And that was really as far as it went. The Happiness Boys weren't snacking on happiness candy during the show. They weren't talking about how delicious happiness candies were. They were really just called the Happiness Boys, and that's as far as it went. Excuse me. Over time, once people realized that audiences didn't mind having that very slight intrusion, as often is the case in Hollywood, I always tell my students, it's like, if that works, let's try this. Anyone upset? No? Okay, let's try this. No? Okay. And the boundaries get stretched further and further. And so what you have over time then is not only do you have the sponsor's name in the show, but you also have a very delicate sort of invocation of the brand at the beginning and at the end of the series. So I've got an example for you here of, oh, that was wrong. Just kidding. Okay, so here's an example from Lux Radio Theater in 1950. Hoping the sound works.
Lux presents Hollywood. Lever Brothers Company, the makers of Lux Toilet Soap, bring you the Lux Radio Theater, starring Barbara Stanwyck and Burt Lancaster in Sorry, Wrong Number. Ladies and gentlemen, your producer, Mr. William Keeling.
Sorry, I'm so sorry that was so loud. I don't know what to do about it. So you have Lux Radio Theater brought to you by the people who bring you Lux Soap, and isn't it wonderful? This was really the model for a long time. Of course, as I say, once advertisers and broadcasters realized no one was upset by that, then they pushed it a little bit further and went toward an integrated advertising approach, what we now would call product placement. Sort of putting the products within the programming itself, having the folks in the series using the products, and that was known as a soft sell technique. And so our esteemed leader here today, Michele Hilmes, describes in her work The Real Folks of Tompkins Corners, which was produced by NBC in 1928. And sponsored by Vaseline. And pitches for various Vaseline products were embedded within the content of the series. Michele notes that the program brochure for Real Folks notes that the storyline of the series was a fitting background of homely associations for Vaseline products, matching up a quaint, simple personality in keeping with their plain, old-fashioned effectiveness, right? So people would, the characters would say, oh, you have a burn, let's get some Vaseline. So they were using the products, but there was always this understanding that the product needed to work within the context of the series, again, to avoid offending audiences, to avoid offending listeners. And they were not meant to be read by audiences as overtly promotional pitches, but rather as sort of gentle reminders of how useful Vaseline products are in everyday life. as time went on, product integrations became more and more overt. And then, of course, as we know, up through the 1950s and into the early, into the 1950s, you have then the development of the 30-second spot and magazine format advertising. And that really became the standard for a long time. And I would argue is still actually the standard in television advertising to sort of have content, and then there's a break and several standard 30-second spot ads, and then we go back to the content. But as we know, that 30-second spot is currently under threat. Over time, concerns about the remote control, folks can change the channel during, and all of this is predicated on the very silly belief that everyone was watching ads before this, right? I mean, I want to get that elephant addressed, right? That people were like, before the remote control, oh, wow, there we go. Like they weren't getting up to feed the dog or go to the restroom or get a snack. But with the rise of the remote control, gosh, this time goes so fast. And then the VCR and DVR, online TV and piracy, there's a concern about, well, no one's watching these ads anymore. What are we going to do? So the answer has been to go back to those old techniques and embed the ads, right? So that people can't avoid them. They're already in the content. Even if it's pirated content, they're still going to see the advertisement. And so this has really been the strategies to go back to these old models. My argument is not only are they going back to the old models, but the reasoning for doing that and the logics and the way that they're employing those techniques is precisely the same as it was in early radio. So keep doing that. So I want to show you some examples. I'll stop talking. You can watch the examples. So here in 2010, Nissan sponsored the premiere of NBC's Parenthood. I want, again, this claim to goodwill on the part, thank you so much, sponsor, is really overt. So I want to show you that.
I'm Peter Krause.
And I'm Lauren Graham. Welcome to the premiere of Parenthood, brought to you tonight with limited commercial interruption by Nissan.
Parenthood is about families who love each other, fight with one another,
help each other, and sometimes drive each other crazy.
On behalf of the cast and crew, we'd like to thank Nissan for their support. Please enjoy the premiere of Parenthood.
Right. And everyone in the episode was very obtrusively driving Nissan also. No bad guys in Parenthood, so you don't have to worry about making the bad guys drive some foreign car. Other foreign car, I should say. So you see, again, this very overt, we would like to thank Nissan for presenting this for us. And the argument that Nissan is a brand that aligns with the values of Parenthood. We're all about family, and so is Nissan. Isn't it so nice of them to help us sponsor this content? So that's sponsorship, and you see this time and again. I also want to show you some examples of the current invocation of the soft sell approach. This is an episode of Bones from 2010, where they're selling the Windows-enabled fancy phone. I have a crummy phone, so I don't know.
You got a wife, Captain? She hook up with Maloney?
Oh, please, I'd have paid him.
Why'd you knock off with that?
They're from Ms. Wick and Hodgins. It appears to be urgent.
All right, just get on with it. All right, be quick.
She doesn't really listen to you, does she?
You're none of your business.
Okay. Again, she isn't saying, thank goodness for this handy-dandy phone, and I can do this really fast, right? She's just using it. And it's overt, certainly, and that's why everyone was laughing, right? There's a very clear shot of it and everything. But it isn't in your face. It isn't sort of driving you absolutely crazy. I have another example from White Collar of Ford. Again, I'll just tell you, because I have another one that's better that I want to show you. Peter in the show is just driving in his Ford and he's using the GPS. Well, where are you? Oh, I can get there really fast. Oh no, it's recalibrating. You know, he's just using it, and he's not talking about, isn't it great that this Ford car is enabled with GPS? He just is using the GPS. So a very, very soft sell approach. And even though we see it as maybe a little over the top, it isn't super overt, like this, which everyone who knows I do work on product placement kept emailing me this. And so I want to show you real quickly this clip from Hawaii FiveO, which I think demonstrates the difference between the soft sell of Bones and the hard sell of this pitch in Hawaii FiveO. My husband actually thought this was a commercial when I was watching it the other day. Oh, sad. Okay, I know, it's coming. It's okay. I'm just new to Prezi. It's fine. Okay.
Hey, how's it going, fellas? Pretty good. You ordered a shrimp truck, but you're bringing lunch to work. Trying to eat smarter, brother.
Shrimp, perfectly healthy.
Not the way I make them. But this Subway sandwich, so on.
Okay, so you're eating these to lose weight. Is that right?
It worked for Jared, and that boy was large. But the best thing about it, you can make it any way you want it. Check this one. Sweet onion chicken teriyaki with jalapenos and banana peppers. And you put that with this, turkey BLT, bam! There's some serious culinary fusion. So how much?
Okay, it goes on. And this got a ton of bad press about a month ago because it was just a commercial in the middle of the programming. And I think that this really demonstrates that that the value of those soft sell techniques from early radio. That when we abandon those logics, when we abandon those techniques, audiences get really ticked really fast, and it just doesn't work. So I just want to leave you with the thought that if we really want to understand the future of television advertising, we actually have to better understand the past of television advertising. So, thank you.
So, writing in 1964, Marshall McLuhan delivered his famous dictum, "The medium is the message." According to McLuhan, the message of television was grounded in the low-resolution image, an image marked by its essential inferiority compared to the image of theatrical film. He asserted that, of the 3 million dots per second transmitted to the viewer, he accepts only a few dozen each instance, from which he makes an image. An abstract image that has allowed television to function as a cool medium, different from the hot media of film, newspapers, and radio. And this is something that was fairly persistent in television theory in subsequent decades. You see it in John Ellis's Visible Fictions and Rick Altman's writings on television sound, etc. So given that this formulation is now nearly 50 years old, it's tempting to suggest that a reconsideration of McLuhan's ideas of the quality of the televisual image is unnecessary, given how often his work has been called into question by subsequent scholarship for exactly the kind of technological determinism apparent in this statement. You see this most notably in John Caldwell's critique of that tradition. So, however, the mythological ontology of television's low-resolution image has silently persisted in contemporary media studies, evidenced by discussions of HDTV as a new technology. When viewed demographically, HDTV appears to be simply part and parcel of the shift to what Amanda Lotz has described as post-network television, a phenomenon dated to the mid-2000s, with the completion of the multi-channel transition that began in the 1980s with the rise of cable and satellite is seen as having established a new equilibrium for American television. So starting from test broadcasts in 1996, it was still as late as 2007 when only 10% of American households owned an HDTV, with an even smaller proportion actually able to access HDTV service. But the number has risen to nearly 65% as of 2011, with the vast majority of American homes able to reach HDTV signals on either cable, satellite, or over-the-air digital broadcasts, which is really a shockingly rapid adoption that compares almost to the initial uptake of TV in the 50s and 60s. And from this perspective, then, HDTV can be seen as simply one of many new digital technologies like the DVR, video game consoles, universal remotes, video on demand, which uniquely characterize the present moment of television. But in framing contemporary television as something distinct from old television, scholars in a sense have simply reproduced McLuhan's claim that improved TV is no longer television. To ground HDTV's meaning in its relatively rapid recent adoption is to overlook the fact that what constitutes a high-definition television image is always a relative concept, and that HDTV as we currently know it has been part of the discourse of basic television research since the early 1970s. So this presentation explores the way English-language technical literature on HDTV, published during the 80s and 90s, primarily in the Journal of Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers, so we're one test slide, functioned as a theory of television. In contrast to a long tradition of media theory in which television's image was seen as inferior in comparison to film, television researchers and technicians reversed this notion by conceiving of HDTV as the new standard of perfection in visual representation. Contemporary scholarship has taken television to be somewhat self-evidently defined by dominant consumption practices, a bias that has led scholars to overlook this earlier moment of HDTV's development. Particularly see this in top-down histories that stress the governmental dimensions of things. So despite the fact that HDTV would not gain widespread acceptance during this period, leading certain commentators to declare the technology dead by the early 1990s, it's an actual cover from Cablevision magazine, this narrative of failure is more than a historical curiosity, as debates over the quality of the televisual image that took place from the late 70s to the early 90s would help lay the foundation for the environment of convergence that currently dominates American media industries. So as television became the preferred viewing site for Hollywood films due to the rise of cable television and home video, technicians reimagined television as an aesthetic medium on the same order as the cinema, a revision with significant political consequences for the meaning of television in the present. So improving the quality of the televisual image has long been at the center of technical debates over American television, dating back to the early development of the medium in the 1920s and 1930s. Beginning with the 50-line mechanical scan system produced by Herbert Ives in 1927, dozens of different systems were proposed during this period. Got a chart from JSMPTE on that. The NTSC standard of 525 horizontal lines of signal, which was established in 1941, was only reached after more than a decade of competition and represented a compromise between the 441-line system of General Electric and the 605-line system of Philco. And here's another slide that shows the numerous different competing systems that were proposed during the 30s and 40s in particular. So, just for example, a system proposed by Dumont in 1939 was capable of rendering nearly 800 lines of image, a number that exceeds the current standard of 720 lines. That's the baseline for what's considered HDTV. So viewed in terms of this historical trajectory, the innovation of current generation HDTV systems is less a project of the current moment of the digitization of television, which is how it's typically framed by scholars, and more a product of nearly a century-long debate over the nature of television aesthetics. So NTSC ensured a relatively lengthy period of tranquility for American television, with only a minor revisitation of the standard in 1953 to accommodate the development of color. However, as the market for color sets reached a point of saturation in the 1970s, because color was actually fairly slow to integrate into American homes, image quality returned to the forefront. And the dream of HDTV actually grew out originally of a 1972 study undertaken by the International Radio Consultative Committee and International Regulator of Television Standards. So according to this study, the goals for this high-definition service included viewing at approximately 3 times picture height, so that the system would be virtually transparent to the quality of portrayal perceived in the original scene by a discerning viewer with normal visual acuity. This new system would demonstrate improved motion portrayal, perception of depth, and colorimetry compared to contemporary standards, with the idea of allowing for viewing on large, wider aspect ratio displays that would leave viewers with the perception that they were surrounded by the system. So while the study acknowledged that television is no mere entertainment medium, the vision of HDTV described here clearly evokes Bazan's notion of the myth of total cinema, a concept that's ostensibly at odds with television's low-resolution ontology as theorized by McLuhan. Indeed, as the authors of this study note, developments in HDTV technology would not only impact the television industry, but also the film industry that would be able to make use of high-resolution digital monitors, cameras, and software for production of both analog and digital images. American television industry quickly took notice of these developments overseas, a lot of which were happening in Japan, which was emerging as the major competitor to the American market for television set production. And so by late 1977, SMPTE had formed a research committee to begin development on a new set of standards for what was then widely known as HDTV. The findings of the committee were published in the journal in 1980. We see a summary of the initial publication. So, this would form the baseline for research produced over a subsequent decade plus, when defining a new international standard for image quality became a central concern for television researchers around the world. So while the study laid out numerous basic premises that should guide the development and eventual adoption of an HDTV standard, they nearly all boiled down to one idea: cross-compatibility between film, television, and digital video. HDTV was seen as a concept with applicability not only to the home, but for every stage of a media artifact's life cycle, from production to distribution and exhibition. From video streamed directly into a movie theater at 30 frames a second to NTSC monitors with 1,125 scan lines and 8:3 aspect ratios, HDTV suggested a general conflation of the aesthetics of film and television, media that had historically been seen as ontologically opposed to one another. Later articles would add further nuance to the paradigm outlined in this 1980 report while reinforcing its fundamental goals, and a ton of these articles that I've had to look at, and so I'm just going to work through a few of them here. And aesthetics were a subject of most of them, including one that defines 35 millimeter projected film as the aesthetic standard for HDTV. This article attempts to establish a digital equivalent for image resolution and stability comparable to projected 35 millimeter film, from which they would directly collect their data. So it would throw up a test chart and try and turn it into something that could be broken down to, into like a basic perceptual unit. And the authors of this study established a resolution of 700 to 800 lines as the minimum for achieving a television image equivalent to that of 35 millimeter film, noting that doubling the number of lines to 1,050 or 1,125 would perhaps even exceed the quality of 35 millimeter film. In particular, the authors note that image resolution can vary immensely for theatrical filmgoers depending on where one sits in relation to the screen, with the implicit assumption being that television offers a democratic and thus superior viewing experience predicated on all viewers being able to occupy the same viewing position. Even though contemporary film scholars have argued for the privileged status of theatrical projection, due to the fact that even high-definition digital images contain less information than 35 millimeter film, which is composed of the equivalent of 2,000 horizontal lines of signal, this article demonstrates that HDTV allows the televisual image to exceed the filmic image in terms of user experience. Thus, this article suggests a conception of television which is figured as simply a modified site of film projection, rather than a distinct or subordinate practice. As I mentioned, there's a lot of other examples I could go into. I've trimmed them out in the interest of time. Consult this essay if you're interested in looking at some more of these examples. But what I've decided today to conclude is to kind of take a move away from this essay. So on one hand, there are some distinct historiographic stakes in studying this problem. The history of television has not really taken full account of sort of divergent technological practice. I think HDTV is a great example of that. From the numerous really failed innovations that were proposed, it's only through sort of a crisis that we arrived at the current standard. It was a matter of competition. So I think that's one level at which we can view this. I think there's a larger level at stake anytime we're discussing the aesthetics of television, something that is frequently overlooked in the history of television. So while I'm given only a small portion of the discourse on HDTV here, it's important to understand the broader political implications of this historical shift in television aesthetics. So in the Critique of Judgment, the foundation of modern aesthetic theory, Kant understands aesthetics as not simply art or artistic production, but as perception, the force that mediates between pure reason and practical reason. It is precisely this notion of the televisual aesthetic as mediating perceptual force that is at the heart of the McLuhanian ontology of television. And as such, the revision of this ontology toward HDTV as a new standard for visual and auditory aesthetics, stereo sound is something that's also been overlooked, marks a larger shift in television's role in American culture. So specifically, I contend that contemporary television's enhanced resolution is a manifestation of the slow creep of the logic of privatization on a medium that is, at its core, a natural resource. Once conceived of as an electronic commons, television has now become a box for playing movies, the home-based anchor for a regime of images that serve the interest of corporate conglomerates that produce high-definition video signals for a multitude of screen-based platforms. And by the time it became a fact of the everyday experience of television, and thus signaling itself as worthy of scholarly attention, the meanings of HDTV were already ingrained in the form of the apparatus itself, a form that was a product of debates that remained shrouded by its initial failure to gain widespread acceptance. So, as the case of HDTV clearly demonstrates, to understand the history of television's present, especially the often overlooked political dimensions of television as a technology, we must first develop an adequate understanding of the history of television's past. Thank you.
Well, thank you all, and thank the conference for inviting me, and thank you all for coming to this session. In fact, I guess I should offer a degree of clarity about the menu, in that after what will be rigorously confined to 15 minutes now, to give us a bit of a chance to chat, talking about aspects of the particular part of Channel 4 that I was involved in for the first 10 years of that station, and then I think we take a break and get sandwiches, if I think pizza was not allowed to us by the people who clean the carpet, but we'll get sandwiches, and then in a, I hope, completely informal coming and going way, I'm going to show a whole pile of extracts from what I'm talking about in terms of policy and principle in this short exposition. And then at the end of that, if there's 5 or 10 minutes there, I'll try a little bit of projection, because I was sort of thinking recently about what aspects of early Channel 4 could be understood as sensible starting points in an entirely different media landscape for the present and the future. So I'll do that at the end of the lunchtime session, I guess. In fact, there's a clip I showed from an interview with Julia Kristeva in one of the Channel 4 programs, and I don't think it's in the clip, but elsewhere in that interview she uses the wonderful phrase, an archaeology in search of a utopia. I think she was talking about her brief flirtation, or Paris's brief flirtation with Chairman Mao, actually, but I think we can still take the archaeology in search of a utopia bit as the sign over the door for what I'm going to do now. I should, just as 2 footnotes en route, say, firstly, there is one of those ambiguous sort of subjective biographical aspects to, involvement in a television station and trying to think about it before, during, and afterwards. Obviously, by and large, people shouldn't stand at podiums confessing self-doubt or contradiction, but I'm never quite sure to the extent, or on some days of the week, I wonder the extent to which those things which one asserts as an objective analysis of the outside world are in fact determined subjective tunnel vision factors in where you stand and what you've been from. So I should be frank about these suggestions being inevitably affected by a personal trajectory. The second footnote is actually to undermine the title. I'm not sure about the overuse of utopia, dystopia as a binary these days. Maybe Alexander Kluge, a German filmmaker, was right. He made a feature film called, with the marvelous title, Artists at the Top of the Big Top, Disorientated. And Kluge, who once said that the avant-garde should be understood like homeopathy, the smaller the dose, the bigger the effect. He said, he had a lovely line in that film about the longer you wait for utopia, the better it gets. So maybe this is the approach. And Michael D. Higgins, who was a local TD and a friend, and in fact a lecturer at the university where I work, ran for presidency in the recent election in October in Ireland. He is now, as a result of strange goings-on, the president of Ireland, and he's a Frankfurt School Marxist. You don't have to read between too many lines to see all that. And Michael D. Higgins gave a talk at the LSE in London last week where he talked about the transformative power of the Utopian project in terms of a scholarship which is genuinely emancipatory, and that needs to be accompanied, I don't have to say to anyone in this room, by institutional praxis, talking about how utopian perspectives can work into the present in terms of smaller scale and shorter term changes. They're not just some fantasy projection. However, 4 sections about how, what I'm talking about in Channel 4 evolved. Firstly, where it came from. Secondly, the first phase, followed by the second phase in chronological order. And finally, how that moment of Channel 4 that the extracts will exemplify, I hope, came to pass, came to go, came to leave. Firstly, the provenance and the context. Obviously there are really important pieces of legislation quoted all the time about when Channel 4 was set up in 1982-83. A law said that it should innovate in the form and content of programs and offer a wider range of choice to British audiences in a 4-channel situation. But that came from a long, powerful build, a lobby group of independent practitioners. There's a wide spectrum, and we could talk about that later, but within that were very clear arguments as to what television could or should be that challenged the long history of the BBC and ITV up until that stage. Now, in fact, that even worked through in an interesting way in the structure of Channel 4, because when Jeremy Isaacs, the first chief executive, appointed commissioning editors, about 1/3 of those commissioning editors came from outside of television. So the very notion of professional, non-professional was undercut a bit. There was Liz Forgan from the women's page of The Guardian. There was Naomi McIntosh from the Open University. Yes, academic, believe it or not. There were some independent producers. I mean, I came from, the kind of Screen magazine end of the London Filmmakers Co-op, which is a very long way from professionalism in television, I think one could say. Within Channel 4, one department, the one that I worked for, saw itself as the kind of edge of the edge, independent film and video. We were actually constituted to push the boundaries late at night. Isaacs' famous phrase was, Channel 4 would be different, but not that different. So precisely that little negotiation of putting something on the screen that someone would watch, and we built it from 6% to 12%, eventually by the time I left in 93, about 15% of the viewing audience, but not quite what they had expected to see. And actually, independent film and video, in that 10-year period, moved from about £1.5 million a year for its programme budget to £10 million. So perhaps about £50 million and 1,000 hours of programming on screen in a decade. And I'll talk now about the first phase and then the shift, which actually was, if one can say without immodesty, a success in terms of how much money we got and how much screen time we got by about the late 80s. So the first phase, starting in 1983 with a eponymous program called the 11th Hour on Monday nights, following Eckhart Stein's long-running strand called Das kleines French Spiel on ZDF. Channel 4 took Monday night at 11 o'clock for a contained space for wilder, stranger things. In addition to that, there actually was 2 runs of 12 weeks a year in an earlier slot time for a thing called People to People, which was an access program, programs made with a community of interest. The 11th Hour was much wider ranging and different clusters of things, but often different from week to week. We operated within an ethos that was clearly set out for Channel 4 that's probably, I don't know if Isaacs used the term, but it's probably best described as radical pluralism. And our interpretation of that was pushing the boundaries to offer alternatives to denaturalize the mainstream through alternatives that I'll show between 12 and 1 o'clock, things which question everything else we see. And also an attempt to widen and open the terrain on which the contention between different forms and different ideas can take place. I suppose at this stage in my life I can be frank about what we really understood we were doing. Under radical pluralism we thought, may, to quote Chairman Mao, God save us, may 100 or 1,000 flowers bloom, with perhaps a kind of implicit left arrogance that in open contention, the ideas which we held so dear might come forward. That's, I suppose, a few hundred years later, that's the Enlightenment for you. If we can actually talk openly, we might have different notions of the relation with the planet, relation between men and women, relation between time and money. All of these things might be different if we could open it up. Somehow find a little space, not outside of ideology, where that be, but at least to shake ideology around a bit. In practice, I mean, that's lofty ideal with a glass in your hand, probably. A glass of Oregon beer would be a recommendation. But the actual practice was using commissioning, fully paying for new programs, pre-purchasing, which means a third or a half paying for something that's sort of being made anyway, and purchasing, and that means going to a festival or seeing a tape and buying a program. We were looking to extend the political and the cultural range. That's number one. That's clear enough from what I've said already, I think. We were secondly looking as an angle of approach in lots of strands of programming to increase direct speech. By direct speech, I mean there's always a degree of mediation and often professional filmmakers involved, but actually enabling a program to be made that those that it's about would assent to. The notion of people ringing up and going in the duty log to say, I objected to that portrait of me or us, was a contradiction in terms of us. And that's true whether you're talking about fiction films from Africa or Latin America, whether it's community films from miners' wives or the Irish community in London or the black community in Birmingham. I mean, all of these programs in their different forms should have a degree of direct speech. And if you want it, look it up, number 19 in the 1948 UN Declaration of Human Rights, the right for people to express their ideas and their view of the world. Of course, the problem is where and how expression takes place, because anyone can go, to the speaker's corner or somewhere in the further reaches of the internet and express themselves. The question is how that expression is communicated and placed socially, and that's what we were trying to work at. Thirdly, ideas and intellectual range, a television station that was not embarrassed or afraid about intelligence, that didn't have to be inhibited or patronizing in explaining ideas and theories. I mean, I have to say, in the last 70 years since I've lived in Ireland, I really know what that means when you try to get your car fixed and someone... Well, here's a quick joke. I've got time for a really quick joke. An Irish guy tries to work on a building site in London, and the manager says, I don't employ Irish people, they're not intelligent enough. And the guy said, well, I don't think that'll be a problem with me. I do understand things. And he said, okay, here's a test. What's the difference between a girder and a joist? Ah, says the Irishman, was Goethe that wrote Faust and Joyce that wrote Ulysses? And that's very much kind of Irish culture, really. Right through society, a sort of sense of ideas and literature and culture and this and that. The fourth, quickly, is pushing formal experiment, and you'll see some of that at 12 o'clock. Approaches to the image and to the sound which are normally up to that point, and again now confined to talk about really niche spaces like galleries. But actually can work very well. Video art came through perfectly to talking about television in an interesting way. And radical form was something to explore. Godard's work on and others, influenced by him about how radical things had to be said in radical ways. I should just say this is not really just independent film and video in a slightly more diffuse and soft way. It's true right across the channel, so that the radical pluralism I'm talking about in terms of our work in relation to, say, sport, a subject which I have no interest, was manifest by the channel taking on American football, which is strange for Brits, sumo wrestling, which is even more strange for Brits, the Tour de France. So the notion of even sports programming was to extend the range and the boundaries in terms of programming. Okay, we're doing some of the stuff I'll show you later, but there was After Dark, which was an intelligent chat show without an end, and actually that became a kind of selling point. You don't know when it will finish because it'll depend on, actually there were junction points, but it wasn't completely controlled in advance. Just briefly, because time moves fast, Section 3 is the second phase, and then I'll just finish by how it went out. The second phase was moving forward into the schedule with more, taking our approach to things into more television-friendly formats like magazine shows. So instead of a series of programs in the 11th Hour continued, People to People continued, so we were given extra money and extra schedule time to take this stuff through into the schedule at a time when the channel's building its audience. So instead of, say, In the Pink, a series of gay and lesbian films in the 11th Hour, we moved into Out, which was a magazine show by, with and from that community. Instead of just little seasons like Vietnam cinema, or which had to be taken off because of the first Gulf War, because it might offend people when Americans are actually at it again. but there was a sense that those seasons could move through into a magazine program called South, or to, in addition, a Sunday night feature slot called Cinema from Three Continents. So, in different ways, we're moving through into the center of the schedule. The media show, I've mentioned Out, South, Critical Eye for kind of radical documentaries, nearly finishing now. Still doing some seasons with other bits of the channel. Banned was one of the best. That was a season about censorship, which was a great idea because it meant we could show everything we'd always wanted to show under the auspices of examining censorship. So we really got some interesting stuff away. WR Mysteries of the Organism, although the genitals were covered by goldfish by Dusan Makaveyev, or Mother Ireland, which I'll show a clip of, which had Mairead Farrell, who was killed in Gibraltar. So, we could actually say these were programs which we or other people previously censored, but now we want to look at them seriously. Okay, because of time, just to finish by mentioning the last phase of probably 1991, 92, where it was clear that the channel was under pressure from a climate change in British broadcasting, and although our department was able to go on doing some stuff, it became trickier in one way or another. I guess the final closure of the whole caboodle was to do with a multi-channel situation in which the notion of Channel 4's brand, and the coloured 4 was an exemplification of that the brand of diversity was seen by Michael Jackson, the then CEO, not to be a viable brand in a multi-channel situation, and so he took the channel towards what was effectively a youth television channel, which is where it still is now, really. I was going to quote Bruce, that great scholar, Bruce Springsteen, 57 channels and nothing on. Yeah, that's where it all went in a way. And I see it in a historical context, because this is a history panel, in which, the Berlin Wall having come down, it's a little bit of historical materialism for you, the Berlin Wall having come, anachronistic I know, but Berlin Wall having come down, there was a sense in which neoliberalism came forward right across the board in relation to health, education, broadcasting, and it was no longer difficult to release the quotes, rational, unquotes, forces of the market to reconfigure British television. And that actually took Channel 4 to where it is at the moment, which does, of course, occasionally have wonderful and excellent and interesting things. But that variegated mixed menu that the work I will show you between 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock flourished in was entirely swept away. Thank you very much.
I want to thank these panelists for being so very timely. I was not really making angry faces or anything up here. They were just very, very good at that. So we do have some time for questions. Yes?
I'm actually not really sure, because my approach into it has been so different than the debates that have been had about the role of the Cold War. I mean, I originally conceptualized this project as a way of thinking about why in the 1990s we have a discourse of family values that's made by politicians who have no experience of the family values that they're espousing, and so resort to treating Leave It to Beaver as if it's a documentary, right, rather than a sitcom. So what I was thinking about throughout the 90s was, that sort of juxtaposition. I don't know. That doesn't answer your question. I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah.
Carol, just as a very, very minor footnote for you, there is a mainland Chinese communist Lassie movie.
No.
By the name of Saigo's Dog. I believe it's from the...
Oh. Uh-huh.
You can find it. It's great fun.
That would yield some interesting images. Yeah. Thank you.
Erin.
Yeah.
Sponsorship. When you were looking for examples of, both the sort of direct advertising within the show and the more indirect sort of placement interaction, did you come across, other than the subway example, did you come across anything else where there had been sort of blowback, and what was it?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it happens occasionally where, and if you do a Google search on obscene product, not obscene probably, but egregious product placement or crazy product placement, you'll, there are people who document this stuff all the time and meet in web forums to complain about how obnoxious it is. Rarely does it get to the point of sort of receiving more mainstream media attention, and even the Hawaii FiveO thing, that was largely a social media complaint sort of situation. I actually did a search for, was there an article in something that I met, and there wasn't, and that makes sense. Ad Age isn't going to talk about it because they don't want to tick off Subway and the folks who are running the Subway campaign, things like that. But you do see it occasionally where the product placement, it gets right in people's faces and they get really irritated with it. And it's a fun experiment. Just about everyone, my students love to talk about product placement. If you say product placement in a room full of students, they go, oh, yeah, let me tell you all about it. This one was so bad and this one was not so bad and things like that. So,
last year at NAPI, there was somebody there from 20th Century talking about how they do digital replacement.
Sure.
So, like, there's a car that's been placed in a show.
Right.
During the first, the first run, and then in syndication, they'll zap it out digitally and put in another car.
Right.
And did you find other examples? Did you come across other examples of that? I was sort of curious if that's really going on, or if she was just sort of promoting it as a possibility.
I think it's being done. I think it's more, at this stage, I think it's more possibility is what I'm hearing, is more that this is going to happen, this can happen. And sometimes there's a lot of, where you hear it is, what we could do is go back and replace all of the, product placements of things that don't exist anymore with things that do, in reruns. It's genius. So that's sort of the rhetoric that's surrounding it. But I don't know that it's being widely used at the moment. But I do think it's a possibility. I mean, part of it is that's expensive, and I don't know that the brand impressions are worth it. I think it's a cost versus benefit sort of situation.
Nostalgia.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. LPs, or now tapes are back, actually.
I think there is a definite scan line nostalgia, especially now that people have realized that NTSC looks better than 480i or whatever. When you get an HD TV, if you don't have an HD signal to put into it, it looks worse than your old TV. I think there is sort of there actually is something that's very constructed about the scan line aesthetic of old TV. If you can find people who will screen capture these things, there's a very unique look to it. So I think that's but it's going to exist as counterculture, only from this point. So.
But the actual broadcasts are digital now, so you couldn't actually have the analog signal, right? Or could you?
I guess you would only have, you could have like a locally directed ones. But yeah, I guess you were mandated that everything's in broad, and as of what February last year. Is that when they made the switch finally? So yeah, relatively recent. So.
If you had a VHS tape that you had recorded analog and you played it back on an old TV, you would be recreating that. But I wonder how would be cult screen apparatus next thing.
Yeah.
Let's see. I think Michael had it.
Rod, you dismissed sports, but in December I was able to watch an NFL game in London with a cluster of 8 or 10 diehard NFL fans who had been created by Channel 4. And I was told that the way they approached the American football, Gary Guinan and others have said this, was by inserting 2 and 3 minute instructional pieces explaining the game. And it's a format that I've almost never heard of in television. Something longer than a minute, but not a full program length. And it seems to have been very successful with that strange little subculture of people who actually like North American football.
These were players that had grown up in countries which, like not here, and see, you said Channel 4
No,
create.
these were all London natives.
Oh, right, from
Locals
London, yeah.
who had become real North American football fans and who watched at 6 o'clock and 9 o'clock every Sunday.
Yeah, well, frankly, there was just physically pushing my sprogs in the stroller around Hyde Park, you would see more and more groups on Saturdays and Sundays playing American football, and that was a direct effect of our transmissions.
Yes.
I mean, I'm sure some American expats might have done it a bit anyway, but they were never visibly present. After Channel 4 intervened, American football really became an interesting thing. And you're right, there was, of course, the necessity to do a bit of explanation, and even more for sumo wrestling. And Tour de France. Actually, Tour de France is one of the sports that stayed on British television, despite the demise of the sports, the range of sports that the early Channel 4 showed. I mean, one small thing on the technicality. Look, it may be untrue anymore, and I don't mean to be rude, but we always used to say NTSC was never twice same colour because it was so terrible. That's a PAL comment, if you like.
I have to say, I used to use a clip from the intro to the American football on Channel 4 from back then, and doing it slow motion with the flight of the Valkyrie as the theme song. That was really, I mean, it just put a whole new light on American football. I mean, you see it differently.
Yeah.
Of course, I think, yeah.
I had a question for Carol. Your comment, the whole study, I think, illustrates the pressures to reduce certain kinds of social commentary. But we did have the defenders. We did have a lot of westerns, other than the ones you mentioned, that really did deal with social justice issues. I often use the example of Matt Dillon defending a Chinese laundryman as recoded by me is about race relations in the American South and so on. Were some of these programs, and I've not done any work on this, written by people like those you're talking about? We've got The Naked City, we've got Herbert Leonard and the people who are producing those shows, like The Defenders, which I remember is certainly in my experience, The Defenders was what I would consider the far radical left in terms of the content.
I was really focused on people who were creating explicitly anti-racist, pro-immigrant content, and obviously entertainment programming incorporated a lot of the cross currents. But I think part of what attracted me to this study was to think about the standpoints that women writers brought to television. They were really different than the standpoints from which some of that really interesting and rich programming was produced. And I would still argue that even by, Eric Barnow talks a lot about Rod Serling, right, and his attempts to do anti-racist programming. So, obviously it incorporated some of that, but I think that it closed off so many rich and interesting possibilities. And it's kind of interesting to think about what's going on in news programming at the same time, right? Because in news programming, you can't avoid some of those very direct themes.
I do think there were some more things, and this part of this is the problem of who has the time and the opportunity to look back at so much of that. There's an early episode of Dr. Kildare, which is explicitly on racist issues, and those things just pop up, and it's going to take a lot more systematic work through whatever archives exist to find more of it.
And LaCour Scott wrote for she did write for Dr. Kildare, so it'll be interesting. I'm not sure if she wrote that episode, but yeah.